You're standing in the Sistine Chapel, 1503, watching as white smoke rises from the chimney, announcing the election of a new pope. The cardinals emerge, their faces solemn, their voices united in sacred hymn. They've chosen God's representative on earth, a man who has sworn sacred vows of celibacy, poverty, and devotion to the divine. But as the newly elected pontiff kneels before the altar, his mind isn't on prayer or salvation. It's on the beautiful young woman waiting for him in his private chambers, the illegitimate children he's fathered, and the fortune he's amassed through simony and corruption. This is the story of when the most sacred office in Christianity became a playground for lust, greed, and unimaginable debauchery. You're about to discover how men who claim to speak for God turned the Vatican into their personal brothel, how papal apartments echoed with the cries of infants born from forbidden unions, and how the very institution that preached moral purity became the most morally bankrupt organization in Europe. Before diving into these scandalous tales of corruption and forbidden desires, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these shocking stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darker chapters of human history. The papal throne wasn't always occupied by saints and scholars. For centuries, it became the prize in a deadly game where ambition trumped devotion, where political cunning mattered more than spiritual calling, and where the sacred vows of celibacy were treated as mere suggestions rather than divine commandments. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of religious hypocrisy. It's the story of how absolute power corrupted absolutely, transforming the papacy into an institution where sin flourished in the shadows of sanctity. Our journey begins in the shadowed corridors of the Lateran Palace, where the whispers of scandal have echoed for over 1,000 years. The year is 897, and the papal court is about to witness one of the most bizarre and horrifying spectacles in Christian history. Pope Stephen VI stands before the decomposing corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had been dead for 7 months. But Stephen hasn't gathered the clergy to honor the deceased pontiff. He's put the rotting corpse on trial. Picture the scene. Cardinals and bishops gathered in the papal court, incense burning to mask the stench of decay, as Stephen VI screams accusations at a corpse propped up in papal robes. The dead pope's body, already partially decomposed, is assigned a deacon to speak for it in this macabre courtroom drama. This isn't justice. This is madness born from the political machinations and personal vendettas that had already begun to poison the highest office in Christendom. Stephen VI strips the corpse of its papal vestments, declares all of Formosus's acts invalid, and orders the body to be thrown into the Tiber River. The message is clear: even death cannot protect you from papal wrath. This grotesque spectacle, known as the Cadaver Synod, marks the beginning of what historians call the Saculum Obscurum, the Dark Century, when the papacy descended into a pit of violence, corruption, and sexual scandal that would make modern tabloids blush. But Stephen VI's reign of terror is just the appetizer for the feast of corruption that's about to unfold. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen himself is strangled in prison by supporters of Formosus, beginning a cycle of papal murders, depositions, and revenge that will define the next century of church history. The sacred office that claims divine appointment becomes a revolving door of ambitious men who kill, cheat, and fornicate their way to power. The papal court during this period resembles less a holy institution and more a den of vipers where every smile masks a dagger and every prayer conceals a plot. Cardinals poison each other's wine, papal elections are decided by bribery and violence, and the sacred college becomes a marketplace where souls are bought and sold like commodities. Enter Marozia, a woman whose name still sends shivers through the halls of the Vatican 1,000 years later. Born into the powerful Theophylact family around 890, Marozia doesn't just influence papal politics. She controls them with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. This isn't a story about some distant female advisor whispering counsel from the shadows. Marozia is the puppet master pulling the strings of multiple popes, and she does it through the most intimate means possible. Contemporary chronicles describe Marozia as devastatingly beautiful, with dark eyes that could seduce a saint and a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver the canniest political operators of her time. But beauty alone doesn't explain her unprecedented control over the papal throne. Marozia wields power through her bedchamber, making and unmaking popes based on their willingness to serve her desires, both political and carnal. Her first conquest is Pope Sergius III, a man whose papacy from 904 to 911 is marked by violence and corruption that would make a medieval warlord proud. Sergius doesn't just break his vow of celibacy with Marozia, he flaunts their relationship openly, treating the papal apartments like his personal pleasure palace. The result of their union is a son, born in sin within the very walls of the Lateran Palace, who will grow up to become Pope John V. Think about the implications of this for a moment. The most sacred office in Christianity is occupied by a man who openly lives with his mistress and raises their illegitimate children in the papal residence. The same hands that consecrate the Eucharist and bless pilgrims have caressed the body of his lover. The same lips that proclaim divine law whisper sweet endearments to a woman who controls his every decision. But Marozia's ambitions extend far beyond one papal lover. When Sergius III dies in 911, she doesn't retreat into widowhood and piety. Instead, she sets her sights on expanding her control over the church hierarchy, using her beauty and cunning to seduce and manipulate a succession of church officials. Her influence grows so powerful that she effectively becomes the ruler of Rome, controlling papal elections and church policy from her palazzo overlooking the Forum. The chroniclers of the time, even those sympathetic to church authority, cannot hide their disgust at what the papacy has become under Marozia's influence. One contemporary writer describes the papal court as a sewer of corruption where virtue goes to die and sin wears the robes of sanctity. Another notes that pilgrims coming to Rome expecting to find holy men instead encounter wolves in sheep's clothing who prey upon the faithful while claiming to shepherd their souls. Marozia's son, the future Pope John V, grows up in this environment of normalized corruption. From his earliest memories, he sees the papal throne not as a sacred trust, but as a family possession to be inherited like any other valuable property. He watches his mother conduct business with cardinals and bishops who bow to her authority, while his father, the Pope, sits like an ornamental figurehead in ceremonies where real power flows through feminine hands. The boy learns that vows of celibacy are mere formalities, that sacred offices can be bought and sold, and that the church exists to serve the ambitions of those clever enough to manipulate its machinery. When John V eventually becomes Pope in 931, at the impossibly young age of 21, he rules not as Christ's vicar, but as his mother's puppet, continuing the dynasty of corruption she established. The transformation of the papal court under Marozia's influence reveals something profound about the nature of institutional corruption. When the very top of an organization abandons its founding principles, that decay spreads downward like poison through every level of the hierarchy. Cardinals who once might have maintained some semblance of propriety see their superiors openly flaunting sacred vows and conclude that such behavior is not only acceptable, but necessary for advancement. Lower-ranking clergy observe bishops and abbots purchasing their positions through Marozia's favor and understand that merit, learning, and piety are less valuable than political connections and sexual availability. The message becomes clear throughout the church. Virtue is for fools, and the clever prosper by abandoning the very principles they're supposed to represent. But Marozia's story is just beginning to unfold, and the depths of papal corruption she will orchestrate are beyond anything we've yet imagined. The woman who made her son a pope has even grander ambitions brewing in her magnificent and terrible mind. As Marozia's power reaches its zenith, she orchestrates what can only be described as the most audacious manipulation of papal succession in church history. Her network of lovers, allies, and intimidated officials stretches throughout Rome like a spider's web, with every strand leading back to her opulent chambers, where she holds court like an empress rather than a mere Roman noblewoman. The year 928 brings an opportunity that even Marozia, master manipulator though she is, could hardly have dreamed of. Pope John X, who had initially resisted her influence, makes the fatal mistake of attempting to assert papal independence from her control. He begins making appointments without her approval, grants audiences to foreign dignitaries without consulting her faction, and worst of all, starts speaking publicly about the need for church reform and moral renewal. Marozia's response is swift and merciless. She doesn't merely seek John X's removal from the papal throne, she orchestrates his complete destruction. Using her network of loyal supporters within the papal guard and Roman nobility, she has the Pope arrested in the Lateran Palace itself. The charges are deliberately vague: treason against the Roman people, corruption, abuse of papal authority. But everyone understands the real crime: defying the woman who considers herself the true ruler of Christian Rome. What happens to John X in the dungeons beneath the papal palace is never officially recorded, but contemporary accounts whisper of a death so brutal that even hardened Roman executioners cross themselves when describing it. The Pope, who dared challenge Marozia's authority, is strangled with his own papal stole, his body left to rot in the very chambers where he once celebrated Mass. The symbolism is unmistakable: cross her, and not even the sacred office can protect you. But Marozia's thirst for control goes beyond mere political dominance. She craves something far more intoxicating than power. She wants to create a papal dynasty that will rule the church for generations, with her bloodline occupying St. Peter's throne as if it were a hereditary monarchy. Her son John V is just the beginning of her grand design. The papal court during John V's reign becomes something unprecedented in Christian history, a place where the Pope's mother holds daily audiences, where church policy is decided in Marozia's bedchamber rather than in sacred consistories, and where the traditional hierarchy of cardinals and bishops means nothing compared to proximity to the real power behind the throne. Visitors to Rome during this period describe scenes that read like accounts of a pagan emperor's court rather than the center of Christian authority. Cardinals wait in Marozia's antechambers like courtiers seeking favor from a queen, bearing gifts and bribes in hopes of securing appointments or benefices. Bishops prostrate themselves before her not in worship of God, but in recognition of earthly power that can make or destroy their careers with a whispered word. The papal apartments themselves become a scandalous parody of imperial luxury. Marozia fills them with silk tapestries, golden vessels, and artwork depicting not scenes from scripture, but celebrations of earthly pleasure and beauty. The walls that should echo with prayers instead resonate with the laughter of her guests, the clink of wine goblets, and the rustle of expensive fabrics as Rome's elite compete for her attention and favor. Most shocking of all, Marozia doesn't hide her control over church affairs. She flaunts it. She issues what are essentially papal decrees through her son, appointing bishops based on their willingness to pay tribute to her personally rather than their spiritual qualifications. She grants dispensations for marriages, annulments, and other ecclesiastical matters in exchange for political favors or cold cash that flows into her private treasury rather than church coffers. The transformation is so complete that foreign ambassadors report to their sovereigns that they must negotiate not with the Pope, but with his mother to accomplish anything in Rome. Kings seeking papal approval for their policies learn to send their richest gifts to Marozia's palace rather than the papal residence. The fiction of papal authority is maintained for public ceremonies, but everyone who matters understands where real power lies. Yet even this unprecedented control isn't enough to satisfy Marozia's ambitions. As she watches her son occupy the papal throne, her mind turns to an even more audacious plan, one that will either secure her dynasty's dominance over the church forever or destroy her in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. She begins cultivating relationships with the powerful Tusculan counts, particularly Alberic of Spoleto, a warrior noble whose military strength could provide the enforcement arm her political schemes require. The alliance she forges with Alberic represents a new evolution in papal corruption. Where previous scandals had been primarily about individual moral failings, popes breaking vows of celibacy or engaging in simony, Marozia's partnership with military strongmen transforms the papacy into something resembling a criminal enterprise backed by armed force. Alberic's soldiers begin appearing throughout Rome, not as protectors of pilgrims and church property, but as enforcers of Marozia's will. Bishops who resist her appointments find themselves facing armed men rather than ecclesiastical censure. Monasteries that refuse to pay tribute to her coffers discover that their walls cannot protect them from soldiers who respect only earthly power. The marriage between Marozia and Alberic in 932 represents the culmination of her transformation of papal politics. This isn't merely a union between two powerful individuals, it's the formal merger of church corruption with military might, creating a power structure that can enforce its will through both spiritual manipulation and physical violence. Their wedding ceremony, conducted by her own son, Pope John the Viman, epitomizes the complete inversion of Christian values that Marozia has accomplished. The same hands that consecrated the Eucharist bless a union designed to perpetuate corruption. The same lips that proclaimed God's word officiate at a marriage that represents everything Christianity claims to oppose. Contemporary chroniclers struggle to find words adequate to describe what the papacy has become under Marozia's influence. The annals of Fulda speak of abominations that would make pagans blush, occurring within sight of St. Peter's tomb. The Chronicle of Salerno describes Rome as a city where Satan has established his throne in the very heart of Christendom. Even allowing for medieval hyperbole, these accounts paint a picture of corruption so complete that it challenges the very foundations of Christian authority. But Marozia's story contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. The same ruthless ambition that elevated her to unprecedented power creates enemies who will stop at nothing to destroy her. The same disregard for tradition and propriety that allowed her to manipulate papal politics will eventually provoke a reaction that threatens to sweep away everything she has built. As the 930s progress, whispers of rebellion begin to circulate through the corridors of power she thought she controlled completely. Cardinals who had bent the knee to her authority start meeting in secret, discussing how to restore some semblance of legitimacy to the papal office. Foreign rulers, disgusted by reports of Roman corruption, begin considering more direct intervention in church affairs. Most dangerously of all, her own son, Alberic II, born from her marriage to the military strongman, begins showing signs of independence that remind those who know her history of the defiance that destroyed Pope John X. The boy who grew up watching his mother manipulate popes and cardinals like chess pieces is developing his own ideas about how power should be exercised. The tension in Marozia's carefully constructed empire reaches a breaking point on a humid Roman evening in 932, when her teenage son, Alberic II, does something that will shatter the delicate balance of corruption she has spent decades perfecting. The young man, barely 17, but already hardened by years of witnessing his mother's ruthless machinations, stands before her in the opulent chambers of their palazzo with an expression she has never seen before: open defiance. The confrontation begins over something seemingly trivial. Marozia has arranged yet another papal appointment, this time elevating a particularly unqualified but wealthy cardinal to the position of Archbishop of Ravenna. The man in question can barely read Latin, has fathered at least 3 illegitimate children, and is rumored to practice pagan rituals in his private chambers. But he has paid handsomely for the position, and his family's political connections serve Marozia's broader schemes. Alberic II watches his mother conduct this transaction with the same clinical detachment he has observed countless times before. But something has changed in the young man. Perhaps it's the influence of his tutors, who, despite their fear of Marozia, have managed to instill in him some understanding of what the Church once represented. Perhaps it's the growing disgust he feels watching pilgrims prostrate themselves before papal authority they don't realize is completely hollow. Or perhaps it's simply the natural rebellion of youth against parental control taken to its most extreme conclusion. Whatever the cause, Alberic II speaks words that will echo through history. "Mother, you have made a mockery of Christ's church, and I will tolerate it no longer." The silence that follows is deafening. Cardinals and courtiers, who have grown accustomed to the theatre of papal corruption, suddenly find themselves witnessing something unprecedented: open rebellion within the very heart of Marozia's power structure. Marozia's response reveals the depths of her transformation from mere political operator to something approaching a monster. The woman who once charmed popes and seduced cardinals with honeyed words and beautiful smiles unleashes a fury that terrorizes everyone in the room. She screams accusations at her son, calling him ungrateful, weak, and unworthy of the power she has built for their family. Her voice echoes off the marble walls like the shriek of a harpy, drowning out the nervous whispers of witnesses who suddenly realize they are watching the beginning of the end of an era. But Alberic II has inherited more than just his mother's political cunning. He has also absorbed her understanding of how power really works in Rome. While Marozia has spent years cultivating her network of ecclesiastical supporters, her son has been quietly building relationships with the military commanders who actually control the city's streets. The soldiers who once enforced his mother's will have gradually transferred their loyalty to the young man who pays their wages and understands their needs better than the woman who sees them merely as tools. The civil war that erupts in Rome during the winter of 932 is unlike anything the city has experienced since the barbarian invasions. This isn't a conflict between foreign armies or competing political factions. It's a family feud that has metastasized into a battle for the very soul of the papacy. Mother and son command opposing forces that turn the eternal city into a battlefield where churches become fortresses and papal palaces echo with the clash of swords rather than the chanting of prayers. Marozia's supporters include many of the corrupt clergy she has elevated to power over the years, men whose positions depend entirely on her continued dominance. They fight with the desperation of those who know that defeat means not just political exile, but complete destruction. Cardinals who have grown fat on simony and bishops who have built fortunes through ecclesiastical corruption understand that Alberic II's victory would mean the end of everything they have gained through association with his mother. But Alberic II's forces include not just professional soldiers, but also ordinary Romans who have grown sick of watching their city's sacred institutions become playthings for a single family's ambitions. Craftsmen and merchants who have seen their businesses disrupted by constant political manipulation join his cause. Even some lower-ranking clergy, disgusted by the corruption they witness daily, provide intelligence and support to the rebellion. The siege of Castel Sant'Angelo, where Marozia makes her final stand, becomes a symbol of everything the papacy has become during her reign. The ancient mausoleum of Hadrian, transformed into a papal fortress, now serves as the last refuge of a woman who has turned the church into her personal empire. As Alberic II's forces surround the massive stone walls, the woman who once made and unmade popes finds herself trapped like any common criminal. The end, when it comes, is both anticlimactic and profoundly symbolic. Marozia doesn't die in battle like some ancient warrior queen, nor does she escape to rebuild her power elsewhere like a clever political operative. Instead, she simply disappears from history, imprisoned in the very fortress where she once held court like an empress. The woman who controlled the papacy for decades becomes a forgotten prisoner, her name whispered only in warnings about what happens when ambition exceeds all bounds. Alberic II's victory represents more than just the end of his mother's influence. It marks the beginning of a new form of corruption that will plague the papacy for generations to come. Where Marozia operated through seduction and manipulation, her son rules through direct military control. The papal states become his personal kingdom, with popes serving as little more than ceremonial figureheads who legitimize his temporal authority through divine sanction. The transformation is complete, but hardly represents moral improvement. Under Alberic II's rule, the corruption becomes more systematic and bureaucratic, rather than personal and flamboyant. Papal appointments are still bought and sold, but now through official channels that create the appearance of propriety. Church revenues still flow into private coffers, but through complex financial arrangements that obscure the theft behind layers of legitimate-seeming transactions. Most importantly for the future of papal scandal, Alberic II establishes the principle that would guide church politics for centuries to come, that temporal power and spiritual authority are inseparable, and that whoever controls Rome controls the papacy. His son Octavian grows up understanding that the papal throne is his birthright, not because of spiritual calling, but because his family's military strength makes their dominance inevitable. When Octavian becomes Pope John III in 955, at the age of 18, he represents the full flowering of everything Marozia's revolution has wrought. This isn't a man who gradually falls into corruption after assuming sacred office. He is corruption incarnate, raised from childhood to see the papacy as nothing more than the most prestigious prize in a game of power and pleasure. Contemporary chroniclers describe John XIV's papal court as something that would have shocked even the most debauched Roman emperors. The Lateran Palace becomes a house of prostitution, where orgies are conducted in chambers once reserved for prayer and contemplation. The papal apartments echo with drunken laughter, the cries of women, and the sound of dice rolling on marble floors where saints once knelt in worship. These stories of papal corruption reveal a truth that echoes through every age, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that the highest offices can harbor the lowest behaviors. From the rotting corpse of Pope Formosus, put on trial to Marozia's dynasty of sin, from papal orgies to children born in sacred chambers, we see how institutions meant to represent divine authority can become monuments to human depravity. The marble halls of the Vatican still stand today, but their stones remember the cries of corruption that once echoed through their corridors. These weren't isolated incidents of weakness. They were systematic betrayals of everything Christianity claimed to represent, proof that when moral authority abandons its foundations, the entire structure collapses into chaos.